"We haven't eaten in 5 days," the young woman told the mountain man who had burst into her cabin. The mountains had always been a place of quiet for Clara. She had chosen to live in the remote cabin years ago, far from the bustling towns and the constant noise of modern life. At first it was a dream, the freedom to wake with the sun, to breathe the crisp, clean air, and to be surrounded by towering pines and rolling hills. The snow in winter made the world magical, covering the landscape in a thick, white blanket that sparkled like diamonds under the early morning sun. But with beauty came harshness. The mountains were not forgiving. A single misstep could lead to frostbite, a lost trail could mean a night in freezing cold, and the winters could stretch for months, isolating her from everything she knew. Clara's cabin was small but sturdy, built by her own hands and the help of a few neighbors long ago. It was made of logs, with a stone chimney that always gave off a comforting plume of smoke whenever she lit the fire. Inside, the cabin was simple. There was a wooden table with a few chairs, a small stove for cooking, and a narrow bed tucked into a corner with thick blankets to keep her warm during the long winter nights. Every item in the cabin had a purpose. She kept no clutter, no unnecessary things. The shelves held a few cans of beans, jars of dried herbs, and some flour and sugar for baking. There were tools for hunting and fishing, ropes and knives hanging from hooks on the walls. Each item was chosen carefully, each one helping her survive. Despite the simplicity, life in the mountains was not easy. Clara had learned to read the weather from the clouds, to know which tracks in the snow belonged to deer or wolves, and which plants could be eaten safely. She had learned the hard way that mistakes could be dangerous. Once she had thought a frozen river would hold her weight as she crossed it, only to break through the ice and fall in. She had survived, but the memory of icy water searing her body stayed with her for weeks. Yet each challenge made her stronger, more careful, and more determined to live on her own terms. The days were long. Clara woke before sunrise, chopping wood to keep the fire burning, and sometimes walked for miles to gather water from a nearby stream. She spent hours hunting or fishing, or tending a small garden that somehow survived even in the cold. The evenings were spent reading or sewing, repairing her clothes, or planning for the next day. Nights were the hardest, especially during snowstorms. The wind would howl through the mountains, rattling the windows and making the cabin feel tiny and fragile. But inside, the fire's warmth and the smell of pine from the logs created a safe cocoon, and Clara often reminded herself that she was exactly where she wanted to be. That particular winter had been harsher than usual. Snow had started early and didn't seem to want to leave. Trails that were usually easy to follow became buried, and the nearby stream froze over, making water collection difficult. Food supplies ran low, and Clara had to rely more on her hunting skills than ever before. She had caught a few rabbits and some fish from a partially frozen river, but the small victories didn't make the cold any less biting. Some nights, when the wind whipped through the mountains like a living thing, Clara would sit by the fire, hugging her knees and thinking about the warmth and food she missed from the towns far below. Even though she had chosen this life, the loneliness sometimes crept in, quietly, like the shadows stretching across the snow outside her cabin. On one particular evening, the sun had just disappeared behind the mountain peaks, and the sky was painted in shades of purple and orange. Clara had just finished her simple dinner, a small portion of dried meat with some boiled potatoes, and was washing her single dish in warm water. She hummed a tune softly, trying to distract herself from the creeping cold that had begun to seep through the walls. The fire crackled, sending occasional sparks into the air. She had stacked extra wood beside the stove, knowing that the night would be long and freezing. Outside, the world was silent except for the occasional snap of a branch under the weight of snow or the distant cry of a lone wolf. Suddenly, there was a sound that made Clara freeze. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, louder, heavier, almost like someone or something crashing through the snow. She put down the dish and pressed her ear to the wall, heart beating faster. The sound was coming closer. Clara's first instinct was caution. She had learned over the years that the mountains held many dangers, from wild animals to people who might not have kind intentions. Her hand moved slowly toward the knife she kept on the table, her eyes scanning the dimly lit cabin for any sign of movement outside. Before she could decide what to do, the door burst open. Snow flew into the cabin and a man stumbled inside. He was tall, with a thick, ragged coat that was torn in several places, and snow clung to his hair and beard. His face was pale, almost blue from cold, and his eyes were wide and desperate. He fell to the ground with a heavy thud, shivering violently. Clara took a cautious step back, gripping her knife tightly. The man lifted his head slightly, and his voice, though weak, broke the silence. "Please, food, water." His words were barely more than a whisper, but they carried a weight of exhaustion and fear that Clara could not ignore. She studied him carefully. He was clearly not dangerous. He was exhausted, hungry, and freezing. Her heart softened, and despite the fear that had raced through her moments ago, she felt a strong pull of empathy. Clara took a deep breath, stepping closer but keeping her knife in hand, just in case. "Are you hurt?" she asked gently. The man shook his head, unable to speak clearly. His lips were chapped and blue, and he tried to lift a hand, but it trembled violently. Clara realized he might not survive the night without help. She guided him toward the fire, urging him to sit on the floor as close to the warmth as possible. Snow fell from his coat in little clumps, melting quickly on the wooden floor. Clara removed her own thick scarf and wrapped it around his shoulders. The man looked up at her, eyes wide, and finally managed to speak more clearly. "We haven't eaten in 5 days," he said. Clara's heart sank. He wasn't alone, he said we. She realized that he might have been traveling with someone else, perhaps a companion who was still out in the snow. Panic mixed with concern. She had just enough food for herself for the next few days, and sharing it meant risking her own survival. But looking at the man's trembling form, she could not turn him away. Clara moved to her small cupboard and brought out a tin of beans and a few slices of bread. She placed it near him and helped him eat slowly, knowing that his body might not handle a large meal after days without food. He ate eagerly but carefully, his eyes never leaving hers, as if trying to memorize a human connection he had missed for days. The warmth from the fire and the food slowly brought color back to his face. Clara felt a mix of relief and worry, relief that she had helped, worry about what might happen next. As the night wore on, the storm outside intensified. The wind howled through the mountains, rattling the cabin walls. Clara and the man sat quietly by the fire. She learned his name was Samuel, and that he had been traveling with a companion who had gone missing during the last storm. He didn't know where the other person was and feared the worst. Clara listened carefully, asking questions only to help him focus and stay calm. Sharing his story seemed to ease some of the fear and confusion. By the time the fire had burned low, Clara realized that despite the fear and the cold, the night had become a turning point. She had chosen to help someone in need, risking her own supplies, and in doing so, she had reminded herself of the strength of compassion even in the harshest conditions. Outside, the wind continued to rage, but inside the cabin there was a fragile sense of safety, human connection, and hope. Clara knew that tomorrow would be another difficult day, but for the first time in a long time, she did not feel entirely alone. The night passed slowly, the wind outside howling like a living creature. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, leaving pockets of shadows in the corners. Clara kept checking Samuel, making sure he stayed warm and didn't slip back into exhaustion. She had given him what little food she had, but she knew that was only the beginning. The mountains were unforgiving, and surviving here required constant vigilance. Samuel's body was weak from days without proper food, and the cold had left his movements slow and unsteady. Morning came gray and cold. The snow outside had fallen heavier during the night, covering the trees in thick, white layers and blanketing the ground in silence. Clara woke early, her instincts honed from years of living alone in the wilderness. She chopped more wood, keeping the fire burning, and prepared a simple breakfast of oatmeal and leftover bread. Samuel sat quietly, staring at the fire, his hands wrapped around a cup of hot water. Clara noticed how thin he had become, how every movement seemed to take effort. He looked like someone who had been traveling for weeks without rest. Once he had eaten a little, Clara asked about his journey. Samuel's voice was weak, but he managed to tell her a part of the story. He and his companion had been traveling through the mountains to reach a small town on the other side. They had run into unexpected snowstorms, the kind that came without warning in the higher altitudes. Their supplies had been limited, and each day had grown harder than the last. By the time he had arrived at Clara's cabin, he had been lost, exhausted, and nearly frozen. Clara listened carefully, asking questions and offering gentle advice. She learned that his companion was still somewhere in the mountains, and Samuel didn't know if they had survived. He had tried to search, but the deep snow and freezing temperatures had forced him to keep moving to survive. Clara could see the fear in his eyes, the fear of losing someone he cared about, of being completely alone in this harsh land. She understood that fear well. The mountains could test even the strongest, and isolation had a way of making the mind restless and heavy. Clara knew that the first step was to help Samuel regain strength. She shared more food with him, giving him small portions at a time to prevent him from becoming ill. She taught him how to melt snow for water safely and reminded him to drink slowly to avoid shocking his system. As they worked together, a fragile routine began to form. Clara chopped wood, tended the fire, and checked the cabin for any weak spots, while Samuel learned to help in small ways, sweeping the floor, stacking firewood, and carrying water from the stream when the ice allowed it. Despite his exhaustion, Samuel showed a surprising resilience. Clara watched him quietly, impressed by the way he continued to try even when his body protested. They began talking more, sharing stories of their lives before the mountains. Clara learned that Samuel had grown up in a small town near the edge of the wilderness. He had always loved the outdoors, the challenge of surviving in nature, and the feeling of freedom that came from being away from the crowded towns. But even someone experienced like him could not have anticipated the harshness of this winter, nor the days without food that had nearly broken him. The days that followed were difficult. The snow continued to fall heavily, making travel impossible. Clara and Samuel rationed their supplies carefully, eating small amounts throughout the day. Each morning, they inspected the cabin for leaks and added extra firewood to ensure they would stay warm through the freezing nights. Clara taught Samuel how to identify safe plants and berries, and they practiced setting small traps for rabbits, hoping to supplement their limited food. These tasks kept them busy and focused, helping Samuel regain strength while also keeping Clara occupied and alert. Evenings were quieter, filled with reflection and cautious optimism. Samuel told Clara about the mistakes that had led them into danger, the wrong trail, underestimating the snow, and losing their bearings in a white, endless landscape. Clara did not judge. She knew that the mountains could challenge anyone, no matter how prepared. Instead, she offered practical advice, sharing her knowledge of the terrain, the weather, and the little tricks she had learned over the years to survive. Slowly, Samuel's fear began to give way to determination. He started to trust in Clara's experience, realizing that her help could make the difference between life and death. The bond between them grew, built on shared struggle and mutual respect. Clara had always been cautious about strangers, but she began to see Samuel as more than just a survivor. He was someone willing to learn, willing to adapt, and willing to face the mountains honestly. In turn, Samuel admired Clara's courage and skill. Living alone for so long had made her resourceful and independent, qualities he had always respected but had never truly understood until he saw them firsthand. One morning, after several days of heavy snow, Samuel asked about his missing companion. Clara suggested a careful approach, emphasizing the importance of preparation and safety. They could not set out blindly into the snowstorm. Survival depended on patience, planning, and working together. Samuel agreed, and together they made a plan to gather more food and warm clothing before attempting any search. This plan gave Samuel hope, a sense of purpose beyond simply surviving the night. During this time, Clara noticed subtle changes in Samuel. He moved more steadily, his eyes less haunted by fear, and he began to smile occasionally, small but genuine smiles that showed relief and renewed strength. Clara herself felt a renewed sense of purpose, realizing that helping someone in need could create a deeper connection to the land and to life itself. Even in the harshest conditions, there was room for kindness, trust, and shared effort. They spent long hours by the fire in the evenings, sharing stories from their pasts, discussing their dreams, and laughing quietly at small jokes. These moments of human connection, simple but profound, made the long nights feel shorter. The storm outside continued, but inside the cabin there was warmth, not just from the fire, but from the growing trust and friendship between them. Clara realized that surviving the mountains was not only about strength and knowledge, it was also about companionship, understanding, and the quiet courage to help someone else when they needed it most. By the end of the week, Samuel had regained significant strength. He could help more actively, chop wood, prepare simple meals, and even venture outside briefly to check on traps and the snow-covered paths. Clara felt proud of him, not because he had accomplished a heroic feat, but because he had endured, adapted, and trusted in her guidance. The mountains were still dangerous, but together they had created a small world of safety, resilience, and cooperation inside the cabin. One evening, as the wind whistled outside and the fire crackled warmly, Samuel spoke quietly. "I don't know what I would have done without you," he said. Clara smiled softly, feeling the weight of the words. She had always valued independence, but this experience had shown her the power of connection. In the wilderness, no one truly survives alone. Sometimes, survival depended on opening your door, sharing what little you had, and trusting that another human being could help you endure the impossible. Clara nodded, looking at the man who had arrived at her door so desperate, so weak, and so in need. Now he was stronger, more confident, and filled with hope. The storm outside might continue for weeks, but inside the cabin there was life, warmth, and a shared understanding of what it meant to survive and to care. And so, the days passed in cautious routine, each one a small victory against the harsh winter. Clara and Samuel prepared for the challenges ahead, knowing that the mountains would not give up easily, but confident that together, they could face whatever came. Trust had been built, strength regained, and a fragile hope had blossomed, proving that even in the wildest isolation, humanity could shine brightly. Days had passed since Samuel had first arrived at Clara's cabin. The storm outside had begun to ease, though the mountains still wore their blanket of snow, cold and unyielding. Clara woke early, as usual, chopping firewood and tending to her small stove. Samuel had grown stronger over the past week, moving with steadier steps and helping with chores around the cabin. Though his strength had returned, his mind remained restless. He constantly thought of the companion he had lost in the storm, wondering whether they were still alive or had succumbed to the freezing wilderness. That morning, the sun barely rose above the horizon, casting a pale light on the snow-covered peaks. Clara noticed Samuel gazing out the window, eyes distant and thoughtful. "I can't stop thinking about him," he admitted quietly. Clara nodded, understanding the feeling all too well. In the mountains, the line between survival and loss was thin. One small mistake, one misjudged step, and someone could vanish forever beneath the snow. Clara had experienced similar fear in her early days living alone, and she knew the desperation Samuel felt. After a brief breakfast, Clara suggested they make a careful plan to search for his companion. They could not rush blindly into the snow. They would need to gather supplies, map out safe paths, and move cautiously. Samuel listened attentively, nodding. Together they laid out the supplies they had left. A few cans of beans, some dried meat, a small pack of flour, and a little sugar. Clara packed a bag for Samuel with essentials, making sure he had warm clothing, gloves, and extra blankets. She also gave him a sturdy rope and a compass, explaining how to use them safely in case the terrain became treacherous. By late morning, the snow had softened enough to make travel possible, though still slow. They stepped outside, the cold biting at their faces, and began their careful trek. Samuel led cautiously, with Clara following slightly behind, observing the tracks in the snow. They had seen evidence of animals, rabbits, and deer, but no signs of his missing companion yet. Each step required focus. The snow could hide deep holes or slippery patches, and the mountains were unforgiving to those who moved recklessly. As they walked, Samuel recounted more of his journey before the storm. He spoke of the challenges they had faced, of narrow mountain paths and icy slopes, and how quickly supplies had dwindled. Clara listened, absorbing every detail. She understood that the mountains were not only physically dangerous but mentally exhausting. The combination of cold, hunger, and fear could cloud judgment and make even the most experienced traveler vulnerable. She offered him advice on pacing himself, on recognizing signs of hypothermia, and on staying alert to the sounds of wildlife and shifting snow. Hours passed and the snow remained thick though manageable. Clara noticed the change in Samuel's demeanor. While fear still lingered in his eyes, there was a spark of determination. He moved with purpose, checking tracks and landmarks, trying to trace the path they had once followed. Clara admired his perseverance. Many people in his condition might have given up, but he refused to surrender to the mountain's cruelty. She also knew that finding his companion depended on more than just determination. They would need luck, patience, and keen observation. Around midday, they reached a small clearing. The trees were spaced apart, and the snow was deeper here, making progress slower. Clara and Samuel stopped to rest, crouched near a large boulder that offered some shelter from the wind. They ate a small portion of food, conserving energy for the hours ahead. Samuel looked at the snow around them, scanning for tracks, but all he could see were signs of animals. Frustration crept into his voice, but Clara offered reassurance. "We'll find him," she said firmly. "We just have to be careful and patient." The mountains don't give up their secrets easily. After a short rest, they continued their search, moving through a narrow valley where the snow was knee-deep. The silence of the mountains was almost deafening, broken only by the crunch of their boots in the snow. Clara noticed that Samuel's steps were slowing, his energy draining faster than she had expected. She suggested they take another break and find a sheltered spot to wait. They discovered a small cluster of evergreens that offered some protection from the wind. Clara guided Samuel to sit, handing him water and a bit of food. While he rested, Clara scanned the area, noticing something unusual. In the snow near a large tree, there were faint tracks that did not match any animal she recognized. They were small, human-like, and appeared partially covered by fresh snow. She pointed them out to Samuel, who looked closely and felt a surge of hope. "It could be him," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. They followed the tracks slowly, carefully, making sure to avoid any hidden dangers like thin ice or hidden holes beneath the snow. Every movement was deliberate, every step calculated. The tracks led them to a small ravine, partially hidden by a slope and thick trees. The sight of it made both Clara and Samuel cautious. The ravine was steep, and snow covered the edges, making it difficult to see where it might end. Clara suggested they approach slowly, testing the snow with a stick to ensure it would hold their weight. Samuel agreed, gripping his rope tightly, prepared to help whoever might be trapped below. The tension between them grew as they descended into the ravine, hearts beating fast but controlled, aware that one wrong step could be dangerous. Finally, near the base of the ravine, they saw a faint figure lying in the snow. Samuel's heart raced. It was his companion, weak but alive, partially buried under a thin layer of snow. Clara moved first, helping to clear the snow and assess the condition of the person. They were cold, hungry, and shivering violently, but there were no broken bones or serious injuries. Samuel knelt beside them, relief washing over him in waves. "You're alive," he whispered, tears forming in his eyes. The companion looked up weakly, eyes filled with both fear and relief, recognizing Samuel immediately. Clara quickly took charge, helping them remove wet clothing and wrap them in blankets. Samuel held the companion close, sharing body heat to prevent further chilling. Clara prepared a small meal, giving them a bit of water and food to revive their strength. Slowly, the companion regained consciousness, enough to speak in faint whispers, thanking Samuel and Clara. The moment was quiet but powerful, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, hope could prevail when human determination and compassion met. The journey back to the cabin was careful and slow. Clara led the way, ensuring the path was safe and steady. Samuel and his companion leaned on each other, supporting one another through the snow. Clara carried the extra supplies, her experience guiding them over tricky areas. Each step felt heavier than before, but the sense of purpose and relief kept them moving. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the snowy landscape. Inside the cabin, Clara lit the fire and prepared a warm meal. The three of them huddled around it, sharing food and warmth. Samuel and his companion were weak but safe, and the sense of relief in the room was almost tangible. Clara watched them quietly, feeling a deep satisfaction. She had known that helping Samuel would be difficult, but she had not anticipated the full depth of emotion this reunion would bring. She realized that in the mountains, survival was not just about strength or skill. It was also about courage, compassion, and trust. That night, as the wind continued to howl outside, Clara, Samuel, and his companion sat together, sharing stories and quietly reflecting on the days that had passed. The companion recounted their own struggles during the storm, how they had become separated and fought to survive alone. Samuel listened, grateful to have his friend back, and Clara felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that her actions had made a real difference. The storm outside continued into the night, but inside the cabin there was warmth, safety, and a fragile sense of peace. Clara realized that the mountains could be cruel, but they could also inspire acts of bravery, resilience, and connection. She had learned that helping others in their darkest moments could strengthen not only them, but also herself. And Samuel had learned that even the strongest person could benefit from trust, guidance, and friendship in the face of life's toughest challenges. The days after the reunion passed quietly but with purpose. The storm outside had lessened, leaving a thick layer of snow that blanketed the mountains in silence. Clara, Samuel, and his companion, whose name was Elias, had settled into a routine, one that focused on survival, recovery, and preparation for the days ahead. Clara had always lived alone, but now her cabin was filled with activity. The fire crackled continuously, providing warmth and comfort, while the three of them worked together to gather wood, check traps, and prepare food. Each task, no matter how small, felt significant in the fragile balance between survival and danger. Elias was still weak from his time alone in the snow. Even with Samuel's help, He had endured hours of cold, hunger, and fear. Clara carefully guided him, showing how to move steadily through the snow and how to avoid slipping on icy patches. Samuel stayed close, supporting his friend both physically and emotionally. Watching them, Clara realized how delicate human strength could be, and how quickly it could be restored with care, patience, and trust. She knew the mountains demanded respect, and one careless move could undo days of progress. Food had become a central concern. The three of them were down to minimal supplies, and hunting or foraging in the deep snow was difficult. Clara taught Samuel and Elias how to check animal tracks and set small, safe traps for rabbits. She showed them which plants were safe to eat, even in winter, and how to melt snow for water without risking sickness. They rationed everything carefully, eating small amounts several times a day, ensuring that everyone had the strength to continue. While the work was exhausting, it was also vital. Every step, every meal, and every decision could mean the difference between survival and disaster. One afternoon, while checking traps near a small frozen stream, Samuel noticed signs that worried him. The snow around the cabin had shifted in unusual patterns, and some branches looked broken as if someone, or something, had passed through. He called Clara over, and together they examined the area. It could just be an animal, Clara suggested, though the concern in her voice betrayed her caution. But we should stay alert. The mountains are full of surprises and we can't take chances. Elias, despite his weakness, nodded. He understood the need for vigilance. The memory of being trapped and lost was still fresh in his mind. That evening, Clara suggested they spend time repairing the cabin. The snow and wind had caused small leaks, and some of the logs were shifting slightly under the weight of ice. She taught Samuel and Elias how to reinforce the walls, patch gaps, and secure the roof. It was hard work, requiring focus and teamwork, but it kept their minds occupied and strengthened their bond. Each repair felt like a small victory, a way to take control of their situation in a world where the mountains often seemed uncontrollable. Evenings were quieter but emotionally charged. The fire provided warmth, but it also illuminated the exhaustion and worry etched on their faces. Clara noticed how Samuel carried a silent tension, the fear that something could still go wrong lingering in his eyes. Elias often stared out the window, lost in thought, recalling the moments he had spent alone in the snow, wondering if he would ever see help again. Clara understood these feelings. Survival was not only about physical strength, it was about mental endurance, about keeping hope alive even when circumstances seemed impossible. One particularly cold night, Clara decided to share stories of her own early days in the mountains. She told them about mistakes she had made, lessons she had learned, and moments when fear had threatened to overwhelm her. Samuel and Elias listened intently, absorbing each detail. They realized that surviving in the mountains required more than skills. It required patience, courage, and the ability to adapt. Clara's stories gave them not only practical advice, but also a sense of reassurance. They were not alone in their struggle, and the mountains could be faced with knowledge and determination. The days continued, and slowly, Samuel and Elias grew stronger. Their bodies recovered and their confidence increased. They began to take more initiative in tasks around the cabin, learning from Clara's guidance, but also applying their own judgment. They gathered wood, checked traps, and prepared meals with growing skill. Clara observed them with pride. The mountains were still dangerous, but together they had created a small haven of safety, resilience, and cooperation. Their teamwork transformed the cabin from a place of mere survival into a space of learning, growth, and shared determination. Despite the progress, Clara knew they could not remain in the cabin forever. Supplies were limited, and the winter, though easing, still posed risks. The three of them began a plan for a cautious journey to the nearest village, where they could replenish food, gather supplies, and seek safety. They reviewed maps, marked safe paths, and discussed potential dangers. Clara emphasized the importance of traveling slowly, conserving energy, and avoiding unnecessary risks. Samuel and Elias listened attentively, realizing that preparation would be key to their success. During these days, a quiet understanding developed among the three of them. Clara, who had always valued solitude, found herself appreciating the companionship. Samuel and Elias, who had faced near death and isolation, discovered the strength that came from working together with someone experienced. The hardships they endured forged trust and friendship, showing them that even in the harshest conditions, humans could support one another. Each shared task, each careful decision, and each meal together strengthened not only their bodies but also their spirits. One evening, after finishing repairs and preparing a small meal, Samuel spoke about his fears. "I still worry about what could happen if we leave the cabin," he admitted. "The snow, the cold, it's unpredictable." Clara nodded, acknowledging his concerns. "Yes, it is," she said. "But staying here forever is not an option. You need to trust what you've learned, trust your strength, and trust each other. That is the only way to survive out there." Elias added quietly, "We can do it together. We have you to guide us." The reassurance in their words filled Clara with a quiet sense of satisfaction. The next morning, they began preparing for the journey. They packed supplies carefully, ensuring they had enough food, warm clothing, and tools for survival. Clara emphasized caution, showing them how to move efficiently through deep snow, how to recognize safe paths, and how to respond to potential hazards. Every step was deliberate, every decision thoughtful. The cabin, once a place of mere survival, had become a classroom, a sanctuary, and a foundation for their continued endurance in the mountains. As they stepped outside, the crisp air filled their lungs, and the snow crunched beneath their boots. The mountains stretched endlessly before them, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. Clara led the way, with Samuel and Elias close behind. Each movement required focus, awareness, and patience. They paused frequently, checking the tracks in the snow, testing ice, and ensuring that their path remained safe. The journey was slow, but it was steady, a careful balance between speed and caution. Hours passed, and the sun began to set behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the snow. Clara found a sheltered spot for the night, partially protected by rocks and trees. They set up a small fire, warmed themselves, and shared a meal. The exhaustion of the day weighed heavily on them, but there was also a sense of accomplishment. They had moved safely, applied their knowledge, and survived together. The mountains, though still challenging, no longer seemed entirely overwhelming. They had faced the unknown, and they had endured. That night, as the fire crackled and the wind whispered through the trees, Clara reflected on the days that had passed. She had always believed in the strength of independence, but now she understood the power of collaboration and trust. Samuel and Elias had learned the same lesson. Survival in the mountains was not simply a matter of physical strength. It was about human connection, shared determination, and the courage to face challenges together. The fire burned low, and the three of them huddled close, sharing warmth and quiet conversation. Outside, the mountains were still imposing, their snow-covered peaks gleaming under the moonlight. But inside, there was safety, trust, and hope. Clara realized that the lessons learned over these days would stay with them forever. Patience in action, caution in decision, and the profound importance of helping one another when life demanded it most. The mountains had tested them, challenged them, and even threatened them, but through perseverance, knowledge, and human connection, they had endured. And as they drifted into a deep, well-earned sleep, Clara, Samuel, and Elias knew that together, they could face whatever the wilderness might bring next. The sun rose slowly over the snow-covered mountains, casting a pale golden light across the peaks. Clara, Samuel, and Elias had packed their supplies and were ready to begin the final leg of their journey to the nearest village. The air was crisp, and the snow sparkled like a field of diamonds under the early morning sun. There was a sense of quiet determination in their movements, a mixture of hope and caution. After days of storms, isolation, and struggle, they were finally leaving the cabin that had been their sanctuary, their school, and their test of endurance. Clara led the way, her experience guiding them over tricky terrain and hidden hazards. Samuel and Elias followed closely, each step careful and deliberate. The snow was deep in some areas, and they had to pause frequently to check for hidden ice or weak spots. The mountains, though less stormy now, still demanded respect. Every sound, the crunch of snow underfoot, the distant call of birds, the faint whistle of wind through the peaks, reminded them that nature was alive and unpredictable. Yet the fear that had weighed heavily on them before had transformed into vigilance and confidence. As they walked, Samuel glanced at Clara. "I can't thank you enough," he said quietly. "I don't know if we would have made it without you," Clara smiled, brushing snow from her coat. "You did the hard part too," she replied. "You survived, adapted, and helped each other. That's just as important as knowing the mountains." Elias nodded in agreement, his eyes filled with gratitude. The silence that followed was comfortable, a shared understanding between three people who had faced incredible challenges together and emerged stronger. They continued along the narrow trails, the village still hours away but clearly visible as a faint line of smoke rising from distant chimneys. The thought of warmth, food, and the safety of human presence gave them energy, yet they did not rush. Clara reminded them that a hasty descent could lead to slips or falls, and the mountains did not forgive impatience. They moved steadily, carefully placing each footstep, using poles and sticks to test the ground, and keeping an eye on each other's pace. The lessons learned over the past days guided every decision. Around midday, they reached a small, frozen stream. The ice looked solid, but Clara tested it carefully with a long branch. Once satisfied that it would hold their weight, they crossed one by one. Samuel helped Elias, steadying him as they carefully stepped across the icy surface. Clara followed, ensuring the path remained safe. Each small challenge reminded them how far they had come. Just days ago, survival had been uncertain, and now they were navigating obstacles with purpose, skill, and teamwork. By mid-afternoon, the village was much closer. The line of smoke had grown thicker, and the sound of distant voices and bells reached their ears. The thought of people, warmth, and proper food filled them with relief, but Clara reminded them to remain cautious. The final stretch through the lower slopes could still be treacherous. They encountered patches of ice, loose rocks, and small snowdrifts, but their patience and experience guided them safely. Each step felt lighter than before, a reflection of their growing strength and determination. As they neared the village, Samuel and Elias began to show signs of excitement. Their steps quickened, though Clara gently slowed them, reminding them that caution was still necessary. Finally, they reached the first houses, small wooden structures with smoke curling from chimneys. Villagers looked up from their daily tasks, startled to see travelers emerge from the mountains, snow covering their clothes and frost clinging to their hair. Samuel called out, and a few villagers rushed forward, concern evident in their faces. Clara helped guide Samuel and Elias toward the warmth of the village. A woman brought blankets, wrapping them carefully to thaw the chill from their bones. Children stared wide-eyed, curious about the travelers who had emerged from the mountains like living echoes of winter's harshness. Samuel and Elias were led inside, where a fire roared in a large hearth, and hot food was waiting. For the first time in days, they could sit without worry, relax without fear, and enjoy the simple comfort of being safe among people. As they ate, Samuel recounted their journey to the villagers, speaking of the storms, the snow, and the dangers they had faced. He spoke of Clara's guidance, her knowledge, and her courage, praising the woman who had shared her skills and cabin with them. The villagers listened, amazed at the resilience of the travelers and the quiet heroism of Clara. They understood that survival was not just about skill or luck. It was about compassion, trust, and the willingness to help one another in moments of need. Clara herself remained quiet for much of the evening, observing the reunion between Samuel and Elias. She noticed the subtle changes in both men, the confidence in their movements, the trust in each other, and the gratitude in their eyes. She felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that the mountains had tested them all, but that they had endured together. In those shared moments, she realized that the true lesson of survival was not only about navigating the wilderness. It was about human connection, courage, and compassion in the face of adversity. After the initial warmth and food, Samuel and Elias were given proper clothing and boots by the villagers. They bathed, cleaned themselves of the frost and snow, and were finally able to rest in soft beds. Clara stayed nearby, making sure they were comfortable and safe. She had spent so many days guiding them through the harsh wilderness that it felt strange to be back in the presence of civilization. Yet, she also felt a deep sense of accomplishment. She had shared her knowledge, helped others survive, and witnessed firsthand the transformative power of human kindness and resilience. The following days were spent in the village, recuperating and preparing for life beyond the mountains. Samuel and Elias slowly regained their strength, sharing stories of the mountains with curious villagers who listened in awe. Clara helped them plan their next steps, giving advice on travel, safety, and survival in other harsh terrains. Though the mountains were behind them, the lessons they had learned would stay with them forever. They had learned to face fear, to trust one another, and to find hope even in the most difficult circumstances. Before leaving the village, Samuel and Elias insisted on expressing their gratitude. They gave Clara a simple gift, a warm cloak woven by the villagers, to remind her of their journey together. Samuel's eyes glistened with emotion as he spoke. "You saved our lives," he said. "Without you, we might not have made it. We will never forget what you did." Elias nodded, echoing the sentiment. Clara accepted the gift with a quiet smile, feeling both pride and humility. She had always known the mountains were dangerous, but she now also understood the importance of compassion, courage, and shared effort. As they prepared to continue their lives, the bond between Clara, Samuel, and Elias remained unbroken. They had faced the harshest conditions, survived the snow and cold, and learned to trust in each other. The mountains had tested them, teaching lessons of patience, courage, and human connection that would stay with them forever. Clara returned to her cabin, now with a sense of purpose and fulfillment, knowing that her knowledge and care had made a real difference in the lives of others. Samuel and Elias moved forward, forever changed by the experience. They understood the power of resilience, the value of teamwork, and the importance of gratitude. The mountains would always hold memories of struggle, survival, and triumph, but also the memory of the woman who had opened her cabin and her heart in the most desperate of times. Even when facing life's toughest challenges, they knew that kindness, preparation, and trust could make all the difference. The story of those days in the mountains became a quiet legend in the village, a story of survival, courage, and the bonds that form when people face danger together. Clara, Samuel, and Elias had endured the worst of nature and had emerged not only alive but stronger, wiser, and deeply connected to each other. They had learned that true strength was not measured by endurance alone, but by the ability to help, guide, and protect those in need. Years later, whenever Clara walked through the snow-covered peaks near her cabin, she would remember the days when strangers became friends, when fear transformed into courage, and when the harsh mountains had taught lessons she would never forget. Samuel and Elias, whenever they spoke of their journey, would tell of the woman in the mountains who had saved their lives, guided them through the storm, and shown them that even in the coldest, most challenging places, humanity could shine brightly. And so, the mountains, once a place of isolation and fear, became a place of life lessons, courage, and hope. The cabin that had sheltered Clara and later Samuel and Elias was more than a building of logs and stones. It was a symbol of resilience, trust, and the quiet power of human kindness in a world that could be both beautiful and harsh. The three of them had endured the impossible, and the mountains had witnessed their journey, keeping their story alive in the snow, the wind, and the endless peaks.